Archbishop Emeritus, international voice for peace, racial equality, and reconciliation, and the inspiration for a new academic center in Indianapolis, designed to be an incubator for social justice. Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary created the Desmond Tutu Center to honor the Archbishop Emeritus's legacy of justice and reconciliation. In 1978, Desmond Tutu was named General Secretary of the South African Council of Churches and became a leading spokesperson for the rights of Black South Africans. But in the 1980s, he helped lead the anti-apartheid movement, and in 1984, he won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. The Desmond Tutu Center at Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary will focus on leadership development in social justice and reconciliation, international relationships, and interreligious bridge building. South African cleric and anti-apartheid activist Alan Musa will serve as the center's first director. The presidents of Butler University and Christian Theological Seminary say that neighboring schools are currently exploring several opportunities to collaborate academically. The announcement of the new center was made at Butler's Clues Hall in front of a sold-out crowd of 2,100 people. The Archbishop Emeritus was on hand for the honor and spoke to the crowd.
Butler University, I would like to welcome all of you to our evening with drone warfare expert Marjorie Cohn. Before we go and get started, just a few housekeeping items. The restrooms are located outside these doors to your left-hand side. The women's is right around the corner, the men's is if you go a little bit farther. Also, of utmost importance, please make sure to visit the Desmond Tutu Center webpage and also like us on Facebook. Also, if you like what you hear, please make sure to use our Twitter handle, hashtag DTC Talks, to start the conversation by tweets. Also, if you're not signed up for the DTC newsletter, please make sure you sign up. You can sign up out here. We also have a really good lineup coming up with some of our events. We've got a really good Butler Arts Fest event coming up called Outspoken and Out Open, a night of spoken word and poetry, and it's going to be an interfaith spoken word event. So there's also more information outside. Please make sure you grab some. So without further ado, I'd like to actually invite Dr. Harry Vanderlinden to introduce our drone warfare expert.
Good evening. Marjorie Cohn earned her undergraduate degree at Stanford and her JD at Santa Clara University. She worked as a criminal defense attorney prior to becoming a law professor at Jefferson Law School in San Diego in 1991. Marjorie Cohn is an activist, scholar, and teacher, and she also frequently blogs. She is the author of Coy Boy Republic, 6 Ways. I guess it's an understatement. The Bush gang has defined more. There are many more ways, I guess. She is the co-author of Cameras in the Courtroom, Television and the Pursuit of Justice, and also the co-author of Rules of Disengagement, the Politics and Honor of Military Dissent. She has edited the United States and Torture, and then also the volume that is talking about for tonight, Drones and Targeted Killing. Professor Cohn is former president of the National Lawyers Guild and testified before Congress on torture. She is currently Deputy Secretary General of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. She is a frequent contributor to the Washington Post and has appeared as legal analyst and political commentator on BBC, CNN, MSNBC, and she also survived Fox News. Dr. Cohn has served on the boards of several organizations concerned with veterans issues. She has received many awards in teaching, scholarship, and public service, including the Peace Scholar of the Year Award from the Peace and Justice Studies Association. Please help me to welcome Professor Marjorie Cohn.
One of the contributors to my edited volume, and I thank you, and I thank the Desmond Tutu Center, and Wasima Ali, and Alan Bosek, and everyone else who has made this visit possible. It's just been a great day. I've been meeting with students all day, going to classes, and then tonight capping it all off. Indiana certainly seems to be the center of the universe these days, with the Final Four, the finals, and the so-called Freedom Restoration Act, which fortunately was amended just in time for my visit. That was a relief. And I know it's not perfect, but it's better than it was last week. So why did I put together this collection, Drones and Targeted Killing, Legal, Moral, and Geopolitical Issues? Drone wars have become, I guess you would say, the signature of the Obama administration's foreign policy. And when we hear about ISIS beheading people, the American journalists, and engaging in other horrific acts, we're justifiably horrified. And when Obama says that we're going to escalate the war in Iraq, we're going to bomb in Syria, there's almost no pushback because of these horrific stories that we hear. In 2009, Jane Mayer from The New Yorker, who actually has a chapter in this book, it's the only chapter that's been reprinted from elsewhere, and it is called The Predator War. It was the first comprehensive study of the drone program. But in preparation for that article, which is a chapter in the book, Jane Mayer interviewed Vicki Duvall, who is a former CIA lawyer who now teaches at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. And in 2009, Vicki Duvall said, and when I quote, I'm going to go like this: "People are a lot more comfortable with a predator strike that kills many people, a predator drone strike that kills many people, than a throat slitting that kills one." And there's a lot to be said for that sentiment today, all these years later, 6 years later. We don't hear the stories of the drone victims, of the victims of U.S. bombs that blow up civilians in Pakistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We don't see the images of the children's limbs and heads strewn about after they have been blown up by a bomb dropped from a U.S. drone. And so I felt that it was important to shed some light on this topic, because when Americans hear these stories, when they see these images, they can't help but feel very, very bad, and also ask themselves, what is going on here? Why is this happening in our nation? So I want to just tell you very, very briefly about what's in this interdisciplinary collection, where in which human rights and political activists, policy analysts, lawyers, legal analysts, lawyers, legal scholars, a philosopher, a journalist, and a sociologist examine different aspects of this whole topic of drones and targeted killing. I wrote the first chapter. It's called A Frightening New Way of War. And I'm going to read a little bit from my chapter in a minute, but I want to just give you a sense of the breadth of the work. International legal scholar Richard Falk explains in chapter 2 provocatively why weaponized drones are more dangerous than nuclear weapons. Now you might think to yourself, well, that's ridiculous. But he talks about nuclear weapons being used only as a deterrent or for coercive diplomacy since 1945. But drones are being used as weapons unconstrained by any system of regulation. In chapter 3, policy analyst Phyllis Bennis describes assassination as central to the U.S. war strategy due to the militarization of our foreign policy. And she details how the war strategy shifted from counterinsurgency with large numbers of U.S. troops to counterterrorism and targeted killing using drones as the preferred weapon. And then, as I mentioned, Jane Mayer's chapter, The Predator War. Chapter 5 is written by USD sociology professor Tom Reifer, who describes the global assassination program of the United States using the Joint Special Operations Command and the CIA, which he calls a paramilitary arm of the president. And he focuses on the effects of drone strikes, particularly on the pilots, who are sometimes 7,500 miles away operating the drone. They can see the faces of the victims of the drone strikes before they drop the bombs, and yet they're many, many miles away. But many of them suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's getting so difficult to keep drone pilots that the U.S. military is offering, the CIA offering all kinds of bonuses to get people to agree to be drone pilots. In chapter 6, political activist Medea Benjamin, who is one of the co-founders of Code Pink, humanizes the victims of drone strikes. She did interviews in Pakistan and Yemen with families of these victims and some of the victims themselves, and she talks about how these drones that hover above these communities terrorize entire populations and destroy the fabric of the local communities. Chapter 7 is written by Alice Ross of the Bureau of Investigative Journalism from London, which is the premier organization that documents civilian casualties from the drone strikes. And she talks about how important it is to keep simultaneous tallies of the numbers of civilians killed, not just to counter the official line about how many civilians are killed, almost none according to the official line, but also to provide compensation for the victims' families. Human rights attorney Jean Myrer in chapter 8 does a legal analysis and talks about, says that extrajudicial killing, that means outside of any judicial process, is not illegal in the context of a legally declared war on a battlefield. However, she says, the United States wrongfully claims that self-defense gives it the right to execute anyone it wants in any country. In chapter 9, our own Dr. van der Linden talks about targeted killing by drones in non-battlefield zones in the context of just war theory. And those of you, many of you I'm sure who have taken his classes, know what that is. He talks about a number of principles of just war theory, including distinction and proportionality. Distinction being the requirement to distinguish between civilians and combatants and not to target civilians. And proportionality meaning that the damage must be proportional to the military advantage and military necessity claimed by the drone strike. In chapter 10, Center for Constitutional Rights attorney Hardis Kabraye discusses the first legal challenge to the United States targeted killing program in the case that she handled called Al-Awlaki versus Obama. And in this case, Anwar al-Awlaki was a U.S. citizen, and his father brought a lawsuit when he found out that his son, Anwar al-Awlaki, was on a kill list. In other words, a target list was going to be, and he was going to be killed by the Obama administration. And the Obama administration defended the lawsuit by saying that al-Awlaki's father had no standing. In other words, he couldn't bring the lawsuit because he couldn't show any harm because his son had not been killed yet. So come back once your son is killed, then you'll be able to show harm, and then you can litigate the lawsuit. That lawsuit, unfortunately, was kicked out of court. In Chapter 11, an Israeli named Ishai Mnuchin, who is the executive director of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, contrasts the discourse in Israel about the elimination of terrorists and preemptive action with the Palestinian discourse of what he calls day-to-day acts of Israeli state terror and repression. And he examines the assassination petitions filed in the Israeli High Court of Justice, including the targeted killing case, very famous case, which Picati, his organization, brought to the court. In Chapter 12, legal scholar John Quigley talks about the blowback from drones, the impact of the policy of using lethal pilotless aircrafts on relations between the United States and the countries in which the affected populations are located, in the context of a history of resentment against U.S. interventions and interference. And in Chapter 13, the ACLU's Jay Stanley brings the conversation home with surveillance drones in America. He talks about the main concern being privacy, the First Amendment right to photography interacting with serious privacy issues, and he says that the national discourse about drone deployment has opened up a space for privacy activists and others to create a genuine public discussion of the issue. Finally, in Chapter 14, political activist Tom Hayden places the advent of the drone age into a historical context of U.S. military invasions and occupations. And he discusses political and strategic considerations, advocating a transparent set of policies to rein in the use of drones and cyber warfare while protecting democracy. So I want to start out just by reading a little bit from my chapter, A Frightening New Way of War. In his 2009 acceptance speech for the Nobel Peace Prize, President Barack Obama declared, "Where force is necessary, we have a moral and strategic interest in binding ourselves to certain rules of conduct. And even as we confront a vicious adversary that abides by no rules, I believe the United States of America must remain a standard bearer in the conduct of war." By the time Obama accepted the Nobel Peace Prize, 1 year into his presidency, he had ordered more drone strikes than George W. Bush had authorized during his 2 presidential terms. The Bush administration detained and tortured suspected terrorists. The Obama administration has chosen to illegally assassinate them, often with the use of drones. The continued indefinite detention of men at Guantanamo belies Obama's pledge, 2 days after his first inauguration, to close the prison camp there. However, Obama has added only 1 detainee to the Guantanamo roster. This government has decided that instead of detaining members of Al-Qaeda at Guantanamo, they're going to kill them, according to John Bellinger, who formulated the Bush administration's drone policy. On Terror Tuesdays, Obama and John Brennan, Obama's former counterterrorism advisor, now CIA director, go through the kill list to identify which individuals should be assassinated that week. The Obama administration has developed a creative method of counting civilian casualties from these assassinations. All military-aged men killed in a drone strike zone are considered to be combatants unless there is explicit intelligence posthumously proving them innocent. Obama orders two different types of drone strikes: personality strikes, which target named high-value terrorists, and signature strikes, which target training camps and suspicious compounds in areas controlled by militants. In the signature strikes, sometimes called crowd killings, the Obama administration often doesn't even know who it is killing. But, write Joe Becker and Scott Shane in the New York Times, some State Department officials have complained to the White House that the criteria used by the CIA for identifying a terrorist signature were too lax. The joke was that when the CIA sees three guys doing jumping jacks, the agency thinks it's a terrorist training camp, said one senior official. Men loading a truck with fertilizer could be bomb makers. They might also be farmers. The Due Process Clause of the Constitution requires that before taking the life of a person off the battlefield, the government must arrest the suspect, inform him of the charges against him, and provide him with a fair trial. Just like the victorious powers after World War II did with the Nazi leaders. This is now a diversion a bit. After World War II, when the leaders of the victorious powers got together to decide what to do with the Nazi leaders who had committed genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the crime of aggression, they disagreed about what to do with them. Winston Churchill said, just take them all out, execute them. But Justice Robert Jackson, who was a U.S. Supreme Court justice who took a leave from the court to be the chief U.S. prosecutor at Nuremberg, said no. If we do not provide even the Nazi leaders with due process, we will be passing a poisoned chalice to future generations. And I say, and many experts say, people say, if it's good enough for the Nazi leaders, it's good enough for the suspected militants and the suspected insurgents and the suspected terrorists. Both the Bush and the Obama administrations have justified their targeted killing policies with reference to the authorization for the use of military force, which Congress passed a week after 9/11. This authorization, however, is limited to nations, organizations, or persons the president determined planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons. It is limited to the groups and countries that supported the 9/11 attacks. In fact, Congress rejected the Bush administration's request for open-ended military authority to deter and preempt any future acts of terrorism or aggression against the United States. But deterrence and preemption are exactly what Obama is trying to accomplish by sending armed robots to kill suspected militants. Last year, the Stimson Center did an investigation, issued a report. The Stimson Center is a nonpartisan Washington think tank specializing in international peace and security. It has experienced specialists from the George W. Bush and the Clinton administrations. And in a 77-page report, the Stimson Center concluded that there was no indication that drone attacks on suspected terrorists had advanced long-term U.S. security interests. Yet Obama has extended his battlefield from Iraq and Afghanistan to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, and Libya, and now Syria, even though the United States is not at war with those countries. U.S. drones fly from allied bases in Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Italy, Qatar, the Philippines, and the United Arab Emirates. Expanding into West Africa, the United States has built a major drone hub in Djibouti. Armed drones are operated by pilots located thousands of miles from their targets. Before launching its payload, the drone hovers above the area. It emits a buzzing sound that terrorizes communities. The drones were terrifying, observed New York Times journalist David Rhodey, who was captured by the Taliban in Afghanistan in 2008 and later escaped. From the ground, it is impossible to determine who or what they are tracking as they circle overhead. The buzz of a distant propeller is a constant reminder of imminent death. Drones fire missiles that travel faster than the speed of sound. A drone's victim never hears the missile that kills him. After the drone drops a bomb on its target, a second strike often bombs people rescuing the wounded from the first strike. And frequently, a third strike targets mourners at funerals for those felled by the prior strikes. This is called a double tap, although it's more accurately a triple tap. U.S. drones have killed children, rescuers, and funeral processions on multiple occasions, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. Obama's administration has killed more people in targeted killings than died on 9/11. But of the more than 3,000 people killed by drones, the vast majority were neither al-Qaeda nor Taliban leaders, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. Instead, they wrote, most were low-level, anonymous, suspected militants who were predominantly engaged in insurgent or terrorist operations against their own governments, rather than in active international terrorist plots. And sure enough, the government of Pakistan maintains a kind of a schizophrenic relationship with the U.S. drone program. On the one hand, when many civilians are blown up with drones, they decry the illegality, the killing of civilians, the lack of the attack on their sovereignty, and at the same time, they wink and nod as the U.S. government is dropping bombs from drones, as long as the U.S. government also kills Pakistan's enemies as well, people that they don't like. Although more than 95% of all non-battlefield targeted killings have been carried out by drones, the killer robots are not the only medium used to conduct targeted killings. The United States also employs Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, to conduct raids as well as AC-130 gunships and cruise missiles launched offshore by air or sea. Drones are Obama's weapon of choice because unlike piloted fighter aircraft, they don't jeopardize the lives of U.S. pilots. There are claims that the use of drones results in fewer civilian casualties than manned bombers. However, a study based on classified military data conducted by the Center for Naval Analyses and the Center for Civilians in Conflict found that the use of drones in Afghanistan has caused 10 times more civilian deaths than manned fighter aircraft. 10 times more civilian deaths. In the United States, the dominant narrative about the use of drones in Pakistan is of a surgically precise and effective tool that makes the U.S. safer by enabling targeted killing of terrorists with minimal downsides or collateral impacts. This narrative is false. According to the comprehensive report, Living Under Drones, issued by Stanford Law School and NYU Law School. Many killed by drones are civilians, or, in the administration's parlance, bug splat, referring to the collateral damage estimate methodology the U.S. military and CIA employ. Targeted killing by drones is counterproductive. General Stanley McChrystal, architect of the U.S. counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan, declared that drones are hated on a visceral level and contribute to a perception of American arrogance. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, concurs. Drone strikes do not solve our terrorist problem. In fact, drone use may prolong it. Even though there is no immediate retaliation, in the long run, the contributions to radicalization through drone use may put American or more American lives at risk. Mullah Zabara, a southern tribal sheikh from Yemen, told Jeremy Scahill, the U.S. sees al-Qaeda as terrorism, and we consider the drones to be terrorism. The drones are flying day and night, frightening women and children, disturbing sleeping people. This is terrorism. The Council on Foreign Relations reported a strong correlation in Yemen between stepped-up targeted killings since December 2009 and heightened anger toward the United States and sympathy with or allegiance to al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Drone strikes breed increased resentment against the United States and lead to the recruitment of more terrorists. Drones have replaced Guantanamo as the recruiting tool of choice for militants, according to Becker and Shane. They quoted Faisal Shahzad, who, while pleading guilty to trying to detonate a bomb in Times Square, told the judge, when the drones hit, they don't see children. Jeremy Scahill writes, the secret war in Pakistan became largely a drone bombing campaign described by CIA officers at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad as boys with toys. By the end of Obama's first year as president, he and his new counterterrorism program would begin building the infrastructure for a formalized U.S. assassination program. Scahill added, with an aggressive embrace of assassination as a centerpiece of U.S. national security policy. The United States uses two types of armed drones, and they're both manufactured in San Diego, where I live, by General Atomics Aeronauticals, which I think qualifies me to be an expert on drones. The Predator drone, which costs $4.5 million, and the Reaper, valued at $15 million, again, both produced by General Atomics. The Reaper houses up to 4 Hellfire missiles and 2 500-pound bombs. It can fly to heights of 21,000 feet for up to 22 hours. Its cameras enable the pilots operating the drone 7,500 miles away to see the faces of their targets on the computer screen as the bomb hits. Targeted killing, which is just the death penalty without due process, according to Clyde Stafford Smith, is an example of American exceptionalism, reflecting the view that the people in the United States are somehow superior to those in other countries. In his 2013 speech to the UN General Assembly, Obama stated, "Some may disagree, but I believe that America is exceptional, in part because we have shown a willingness through the sacrifice of blood and treasure to stand up not only for our own narrow self-interest, but for the interests of all." But in addition to the U.S. soldiers killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands of people in those countries have been killed and untold numbers wounded. And Obama repeated that phrase, America is exceptional, in his 2015 State of the Union address. American exceptionalism reared its head after the February 2013 leak of a Department of Justice white paper that described circumstances under which the president could order the targeted killing of U.S. citizens. There had been little public concern in the United States about drone strikes killing people in other countries. But when it was revealed that U.S. citizens might be targeted, Americans were outraged. This was exemplified by Senator Rand Paul's 13-hour filibuster of John Brennan's nomination for CIA director. It is this double standard that motivated Nobel Peace Prize winner Archbishop Desmond Tutu, for whom this center is named, to pen a compelling letter to the editor of the New York Times, in which he wrote, "Do the United States," and it's been flashing up here, but I want to read it all together, it's not long. "Do the United States," and these are the words of Desmond Tutu, "the United States and its people really want to tell those of us who live in the rest of the world that our lives are not of the same value as yours? That President Obama can sign off on a decision to kill us with less worry about judicial scrutiny than if the target is an American? Would your Supreme Court really want to tell humankind that we, like the slave Dred Scott in the 19th century, are not as human as you are? I cannot believe it. I used to say of apartheid that it dehumanized its perpetrators as much if not more than, its victims. Your response as a society to Osama bin Laden and his followers threatens to undermine your moral standards and your humanity. It was that letter that I saw in the New York Times that motivated me to contact Archbishop Tutu and ask him to write the foreword to this volume, which he graciously agreed to do. And he elaborates on that sentiment in the foreword to the book. In May 2013, as international criticism targeted Obama's drone policy and the continued indefinite detention at Guantanamo, where detainees were starving themselves to death and military guards were violently force-feeding them, the president delivered a speech at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. He explained that the United States is at war with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and their associated forces without defining who those associated forces are. Although he defended his use of drones in targeted killing, Obama proclaimed, "America does not take strikes when we have the ability to capture individual terrorists. Our preference is always to detain, interrogate, and prosecute them." Now, as Obama was delivering his remarks at the National Defense University, the White House issued a fact sheet that listed as an outline of the preconditions for the use of lethal force. The actual guidelines remain classified, but I want to very briefly tell you what those guidelines are, or at least what the fact sheet says. First, there is a requirement of a legal basis for the use of lethal force. It doesn't define whether legal basis includes ratified treaties, including the UN Charter. And when the United States ratifies a treaty, it becomes part of U.S. law under the Supremacy Clause of the Constitution. The UN Charter prohibits the use of military force except in self-defense or when approved by the Security Council. The Security Council has not approved any of these drone strikes, and in fact, Obama admits that ISIS does not pose an imminent threat to the United States. Second, the target must pose a continuing imminent threat to U.S. persons. But the fact sheet doesn't define continuing or imminent. And the recently leaked Department of Justice white paper says that a U.S. citizen can be killed even where there is no clear evidence that a specific attack on U.S. persons and interests will take place in the immediate future. So you wonder what imminent really means. Number three, there must be near certainty that the terrorist target is present. But Obama has continued to carry out signature strikes, the crowd killings, in an area of suspicious activity where they don't even have targets that they're aiming at. Number four, there must be near certainty that non-combatants will not be killed or injured. Now, the administration, as I've told you, defines combatants as all men of military age in a strike zone unless there is information posthumously proving them innocent. So you wonder how they can abide by that condition. 5, there must be an assessment that capture is not feasible. It's not clear what feasible means, infeasible means, but as you read further, infeasible appears to mean inconvenient. 6, there must be an assessment that relevant governmental authorities in the country where the attack is contemplated cannot or will not effectively address the threat to U.S. persons, which is left undefined. And 7, there must be an assessment that no other reasonable alternatives exist to the threat to U.S. persons, also left undefined. But the fact sheet would excuse these preconditions when the president takes action in extraordinary circumstances, which are both lawful and necessary to protect the United States or its allies. No definition of extraordinary circumstances. Now, the media has widely reported that, in fact, the Obama administration is not complying with these rules, and Obama has said explicitly that he doesn't feel bound by those rules in his war against ISIS in Iraq and in Syria. The month before Obama gave his speech, McClatchy reported that the administration had been misrepresenting the types of groups and individuals it was targeting with drones in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Citing classified U.S. intelligence reports, the McClatchy piece said that contrary to the administration's claims that it had deployed drones only against known senior leaders of al-Qaeda and allied groups, it had in fact targeted and killed hundreds of suspected low-level Afghan, Pakistani, and other militants in scores of strikes in Pakistan. At times, the CIA killed people who were only suspected, associated with, or who probably belonged to militant groups, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. And they also said that McClatchy's findings indicate the administration is misleading the public about the scope of who can be legitimately targeted. Obama's claim of vast executive power to kill anyone he wants, with no judicial involvement, is precisely what the Founding Fathers feared when they wrote 3 co-equal branches of government into the Constitution to check and balance each other. Another disturbing issue is that the unlawful precedent the United States is setting with its use of killer drones and other forms of targeted killing not only undermines the rule of law, it will also prevent the United States from reasonably objecting when other countries that obtain drone technology develop kill lists of persons those countries believe represent threats to them. And it was recently revealed that the United States is going to be selling weaponized drones to other countries. It's a $6 billion industry. And as we know from studying history, today's freedom fighters become tomorrow's terrorists. And so countries that are our allies today may not be our allies tomorrow, and yet they will have this killer drone technology that they can use against us. Drones and targeted killing will not solve the problem of terrorism. If you use the drone and the selected killings and do nothing on the other side, then you get rid of individuals. But the root causes are still there. Former Somali Foreign Minister Ismail Mahmoud Houri told Jeremy Scahill. The root causes are not security. The root causes are political and economic. A Pentagon study conducted during the Bush administration concluded, it's a Pentagon study, Muslims do not hate our freedom, but rather they hate our policies. It identified American direct intervention in the Muslim world through the U.S.'s one-sided support in favor of Israel, support for Islamic tyrannical regimes in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and primarily the American occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan. That's the Pentagon speaking. These policies, which are rationalized to stop terrorism, paradoxically elevate the stature of and support for Islamic radicals. Becker and Shane of the New York Times sounded an alarm about the ramifications of drone strikes on the future of U.S. relations with Muslim countries. They noted, Obama's focus on strikes has made it impossible to forge, for now, the new relationship with the Muslim world that he had envisioned. Both Pakistan and Yemen are arguably less stable and more hostile to the United States than when Mr. Obama became president. And we know that Yemen's government collapsed. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen. The United States and some other countries are helping in that bombing effort. In fact, Egypt is also helping mightily with that effort. And coincidentally, Obama lifted the moratorium on sending military aid to Egypt, which underwent a coup a couple of years ago, just in time for Egypt to provide assistance to Saudi Arabia's bombing of Yemen. Just a coincidence. Justly or not, drones have become a provocative symbol of American power, running roughshod over national sovereignty and killing innocents. We ignore this admonition at our peril. Until we stop invading other countries with Muslim populations, occupying their lands, torturing their people, and killing them with drones, we will never be safe from terrorism. Thank you.
Testing. Can you guys hear me okay in the back?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. So now for a more interactive part, we're going to have a Q&A session. The way it's going to work is if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then DTC's lovely program coordinator, Ann Inger, will come to you with the mic. Please identify yourself, and then ask the question. Also, I would be remiss if I did not recognize our partners in this event. I would like to recognize the AIRS Fund, the Butler University Department of Philosophy and Religion, and Butler University's Amnesty International. I know Amnesty has some information, or they have like a laptop set up outside, so make sure you guys go pay that a visit. And then also, like I said before, please go ahead and like us on Facebook. Also, BCR credit, this does count for BCR credit. Unfortunately, Caitlin, I believe, has left. But if you did not get your BCR credit, I don't know what you can do now.
You can probably leave your name with me and I can.
Yeah, we can submit it for you. And then lastly, books will be on sale for about $27, including tax, right out here. And then Marjorie will be here to sign up. So, all right, with that, without further ado, any questions? Who's going to be the first one?
Thank you. You hear me? Okay. You described what appears to be a lot of changes. These changes seem tied together. So there seems to be a transfer of power, not just in the United States, but globally, between ordinary citizens and the power elite, Obama and the presidency. And this transfer of power seems to be different from country to country, but it seems to be kind of a generalized thing. And it calls into question the notion of national sovereignty. I say that might be becoming a bit of an ecology. These actions call into question the rule of law, whether or not it really functions, if we can behave contrary to U.S. law and the Sixth Amendment, things like that. And this notion of American exceptionalism suggests that there's a sort of increased level of classes between people, not just between different nations, but classes of people, between the ordinary citizen and the power elite. So there seems to be a number of changes that are all kind of tied to this transfer of power away from the ordinary citizenry to the power elite, which is a threat to democracy and calls all these other things into question. Can you comment on that?
Yes. I'm not quite sure when the people actually did have the power. Certainly less now after Citizens United, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case in which the majority of the Supreme Court said that unlimited amounts of campaign funds can be used in elections, which means there can be special interest groups, and there are special interest groups that are very involved in who gets elected in our country. But I think there has been a tremendous assault on the rule of law. It didn't begin with Obama. It didn't even begin with George W. Bush. If you look at U.S. history, and for example, take torture. Torture did not begin during the Bush administration. Torture, certain slaves were tortured during slave times. The CIA developed torture manuals, the Kubark manuals, and trained military leaders and dictators from Latin American countries in the 70s and 80s in torture techniques at the School of the Americas. Torture was used in Vietnam. And it kind of reached a zenith during the Bush administration, and with the leak of the photographs from Abu Ghraib penetrated the national discourse. But that was really the tip of the iceberg. And we saw that in the, I think it was December, release of the executive summary of the 67-page Senate Intelligence Committee report on the interrogation program, the CIA interrogation program during the Bush administration, which showed that it was pervasive, widespread, that the CIA lied about how effective it really was, that in fact the FBI got much more valuable intelligence using humane methods than the CIA using torture and some horrific things that I would have been studying and writing about torture for years, but didn't even know about. And so the rule of law, when you look at it, one of my books that Dr. Van der Linden mentioned, Cowboy Republic, 6 Ways the Bush Gang has defied the law, documented, and it's true, there are only 6, I couldn't write a book this big, it wasn't practical, but one of the chapters focuses on torture, and torture is considered to be a war crime under the U.S. War Crimes Act, and also under the Geneva Conventions, and also the war in Iraq, which was illegal, which violated the UN Charter, which was not conducted in self-defense. There were lies about weapons of mass destruction. The administration was repeatedly told that by weapons inspectors, that in fact the chemical and biological weapons which Saddam Hussein did have, many of whom he got from the United States back in the 80s, had been destroyed in the first Gulf War through the years of punishing sanctions. Clinton's bombing of Iraq on the eve of his impeachment, you might remember, he started bombing Iraq again, coincidental timing. And so you have, and Guantanamo, where men who are innocent are still there and have not been released. They have been determined to have no connection with terrorism, innocent of any kind of criminal activity, and yet they're still there for years, some of them since January of 2002, which is 13 years now, in violation of not just U.S. law, but also the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is a treaty the United States has ratified, making it part of U.S. law, which forbids arbitrary detention. In the Obama administration, with the drone program, with assassination, with the surveillance that Edward Snowden revealed for us, with war crimes that were committed actually during the Bush administration. How many of you have seen the collateral murder video? Have you seen that? It's a video that Chelsea Manning released showing an American helicopter hovering above a group of civilians, including 2 Reuters journalists who were unarmed, and talking between themselves and then dropping bombs on them. And then a van pulls up to rescue the wounded. The van is bombed. And then there's a dead body lying in the street, and an army jeep drives over the body. 3 different discrete violations of the Geneva Conventions. So when we talk about the rule of law, it has been so severely attacked in the last period of time. And you also said American exceptionalism and the power elite. I'm not, now it may be the power elite or the corporate media that is perpetuating this myth of American exceptionalism, but that certainly does filter down to people who are not in the upper classes. I think that a lot of people in this country really believe that Americans are better than everyone else. I really do, even though we're a melting pot of, there really are no Native Americans except the Native Americans. We all come from immigrant backgrounds, and yet we're America, we're different. And the other thing that Obama continually says is because we're exceptional, we have to lead. We have to be the leaders of the world. If you look at his speeches and do a Google on lead or leaders, you will see it comes up hundreds of times. We have to lead the world because we're exceptional. And, it makes a lot of us feel good to think that we're better than everybody else, but if you think about it, it should make us feel worse that we feel that way. Because, Archbishop Tutu is one of the leading humanists in the world, and he bridles at that characterization, and rightfully so.
Thank you. We've got a question in the back. And then please make sure you try to talk into the mic.
Can you hear me? So my name's Nick, and I have a main question and a follow-up question. In your opinion, what role do, strictly speaking, technological advances have on the increased use of drones? And then my follow-up question to that would be, is this dehumanization tied to the use of military force just an inevitability of technology advancements?
Okay, yes. Technological advances. I started reading a book called Kill Chain by Andrew Coburn. I actually heard about it on Jon Stewart and then read part of it on the plane on the way over. And he talks about the history of drones and how they've been trying to develop this drone technology for years. And I remember during the Vietnam War, because I was an anti-Vietnam War activist, they had what were called people sniffers. We had people sniffers, where we had the technology to determine where human beings were in the jungles of Vietnam because of the smell of urine. And so it's called people sniffers. And the North Vietnamese, who were generally one step ahead of us, hung bags of urine all over the jungle as kind of decoys. But then there were several attempts at developing drone technology, and it was only once we developed the GPS, you all know GPS, right? Technology. I actually have a smartphone for the first time, much too smart for me, but I'm learning, and one of the things it has is GPS, which is the voice of the woman who's telling me where to go all the time. And if I listen to what she says, generally I get to the place I want to go. So it's this GPS technology that actually led to the use of these drones, remotely piloted robots, and then they were weaponized, and then of course they can drop weapons on people. Now, the next level of that technology, this is something that Dr. Van der Linden writes about, talks about a lot, is called LARS, Lethal Automated Robot Systems, which have no human involvement at all. There's no pilot directing them at all. The computer itself, the robot itself, decides who, when, and where to target. Who, when, and where to kill. And think about the ramifications of that. It's almost like people who are as old as I am used to read about this in science fiction books. And yet, there's tremendous concern in the United Nations about this. Two of the special rapporteurs have called for a moratorium on LARS. Dr. Van der Linden and others have called for a completely outlawing them. But that's where we're headed. We're headed to completely robot and completely mechanized system. And is dehumanization inevitable? I used to say that technology itself is neither good nor bad. It's value neutral. It's a question of how it's used. But when you have things like lethal automated robot systems, it's inevitable. It's inevitable that that dehumanization is going to take place. And again, I think the most common argument in favor of using weaponized drones is that Americans don't get killed. That's why Obama loves them so much. Americans don't get killed. So people in other countries get killed, but we don't see the coffins coming back. We don't see the body bags coming back. One of the things that the U.S. government learned in Vietnam is that Americans get very upset when they see American dead bodies coming back. 58,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam. And I remember pictures. They tried to sanitize it even in those days, but I remember pictures of these body bags coming back. During the Bush administration, they wouldn't allow flag-draped caskets to be filmed or broadcast because they knew that that would upset Americans. I believe that Americans would also be upset if they saw the results of these drone strikes and these dead women and children. But we've again been what we see is sanitized by the media. We don't see these images. We don't hear these stories. When I was a freshman at Stanford, I had arrived, fresh out of high school, cheerleader, homecoming princess, joined the pep club right away, and then I went to the student union. We had a film series there. This was in 1967. So I went to see a film. It was a black and white film, kind of grainy, and running from a helicopter, a U.S. Bomber, I guess, which had just dropped napalm on her. Napalm is a chemical that burns to the bone, was a naked 9-year-old girl running away. It's an iconic photograph. In fact, it's on the internet now because we're about to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the end of the Vietnam War. And my decision to spend the rest of my life working for peace and becoming very active in the anti-war movement was not an intellectual decision at all. I didn't read a bunch of books and weighed everything and made a decision. It was just a gut-wrenching emotional reaction to seeing this film. And I think of that, and then I think of how Americans would react if they saw a similar film showing the victims of our drone strikes. I really think that people would be very, very incensed. And so, yes, I do think that the way the technology is moving and the way it is controlled is certainly leading to increased dehumanization.
Question down here. We've got two, so let's go here first and then the first one. The second.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. It's been so wonderful just to capsulize everything all together like this. As an extension of kind of where you were ending, talking about the different countries, and maybe a little like your point, the United States has, and some other Western countries are kind of fostering this new United Arab Defense Force. And I kind of look at that as, I think Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and they're actually talking about forming an organized force, which I think, if we ever got to the point of being able to rejuvenate the Arab Spring, it would be a whole different picture if we've got a united force of, when I looked at the countries that were listed to be part of that, they're all ones who were definitely on the defense against any kind of Arab Spring in their countries. And the United States, it was on the radio the other day, they were talking about how that united force is a place to actually sell all our weapons to. That, we sell to Saudi Arabia and give to Egypt or whatever, but that this will generate a lot more sales. So I'm wondering what you would sort of looking at that, thinking about, because as you said, we have problems just even controlling the drones, the pilots, and those kind of things here in the States. So if we start farming out not only having other people do our job, but even having those countries be responsible to, we give them the data of where to go drone people, and they might take it over, I don't know. So farming out the whole deal.
I think we're playing with fire. I really do. And if you see what we're doing in Iraq and Syria with ISIS, which is a pro-Sunni, they're pro-Sunni, fighting against them, and of course we're allied with Iran, our children, against ISIS. But then what we're doing in Yemen is supporting Saudi Arabia, who are Sunni, in their attacks on Yemen, and it seems like we're playing not just both ends against the middle, but several ends against the middle in a very, very, very dangerous game. And Saudi Arabia is one of our closest allies. You notice we do nothing to antagonize Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is incredibly powerful, and the U.S. government complains about human rights violations in other countries selectively, right? Selectively. So we talk about, for example, Cuba. Cuba, which has allegedly human rights violations in the civil and political arena, but Cuba, which is way ahead of us in paid maternity leave, full employment, equal pay for equal work. And yet we look at Saudi Arabia, who has some of the worst human rights records, has one of the worst human rights records in the world, especially vis-a-vis women, gays, people who are not Sunnis, and yet we are completely uncritical of the policies of Saudi Arabia. And it seems like it's a knee-jerk response to different developments. There is not really a strategy, except perhaps the strategy is if you see a hornet's nest, take a stick and bat at it, and that's what we've been doing, which can only lead to disaster. So my feeling is we do not belong there. Our oil is not under their soil, that is their oil. And we are making things much, much worse. Certainly, we made things much, much worse in Iraq, and I'm no fan of Saddam Hussein, but we totally destabilized that country. ISIS never existed in Iraq before that. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq before that. And now all hell has broken loose. And so it makes me very, very nervous. The allies that we are allying with to take military action. Obama was itching to bomb Syria until Putin, of all people, worked out this agreement that Syria would destroy its chemical weapons, and the American public, and particularly people in the American military, were against going in and bombing the Assad regime. We're playing both ends against the middle in Syria, right? We're anti-Assad and we're anti-ISIS, and Assad and ISIS are also enemies. And so it's a very, very dangerous game, and I think it can only get worse.
All right, I think we have time for one, maybe two questions. There's one hand here.
So my question is, in your opinion, how much power does a president really have in this regard, in specific regard you've been discussing, drone attacks, military, industrial, complex sort of activity? I mean, can he, not to be cliche or too juvenile, but isn't he just a bit of a puppet when it comes to this sort of thing?
I think there's something to be said for that. Obama is very inexperienced. He's a great orator. He's very smart. He's a constitutional law professor. But when the military, when the intelligence authorities say, look, if we don't do X, Y, and Z and bomb and drone, then we're going to be attacked and it'll be horrible and it'll be on your watch and you've got to do these things. And it's probably very difficult to resist that. He has just concluded, he, not alone, with a number of other countries, concluded the framework of an agreement about Iran's nuclear program, which is a lot of loose ends and questions, but is promising. And yet you have what may be the precipice of a constitutional crisis in this country, where the Republicans in Congress and some Democrats, including Charles Schumer, just came out and said that he was going to oppose that, may well have enough votes to override any veto by Obama if they come out and say, no, we're not going to allow that agreement with Iran. And of course, Israel, who is very powerful in U.S. foreign policy, is very much against that agreement. The constitutional crisis will come because the Constitution says that the president is the one who controls our foreign policy, and yet you're going to have the Congress who is going to try to come in and say, look, we don't like that agreement that you were concluding with another country, with Iran. I don't know how it's going to turn out. It's very dangerous. Israel is saying that military force is still on the table. Israel, who has a considerable arsenal of nuclear weapons. Israel and the United States as well have not signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, so they are not subject to inspections, and yet they are coming down very hard on Iran, even though there is no concrete evidence that Iran is developing nuclear weapons. They say that they're using nuclear power for peaceful purposes, which is allowed under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I'm not privy to the internal workings of the government. I don't have any inside information, but my sense is that there's some very powerful forces there, and it has to be a difficult position for Obama to be in, although he certainly, I'm sure, has made a number of decisions that have vast ramifications, regardless of what we got from other sources.
I think we had two questions up there. Let's try to keep the questions a little brief, maybe so we have time for a few.
So you discussed a lot about drone warfare in the name of self-defense and its future, but what about humanitarian intervention? Where do you see it going in humanitarian it helping at all? Could it be of any use in that aspect of it?
Humanitarian intervention has now, the modern version of humanitarian intervention is called responsibility to protect, or R2P. It comes out of an outcome document from 2005 from the General Assembly, talking about how countries have the responsibility to protect their own citizens against genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing. And if countries cannot protect their own citizens, then other countries have the responsibility to protect foreign citizens against these particular crimes. And so this R2P was used as the rationale for the U.S.-led NATO forces to go in and bomb Libya. Now, there was a Security Council resolution that authorized a no-fly zone, but it did not authorize regime change. So the U.S.-led NATO forces went way beyond the Security Council resolution, changing the regime, kicking out Muammar Gaddafi. The problem with this whole concept of humanitarian intervention or responsibility to protect is who decides that there's a humanitarian crisis? Who decides that there's a responsibility to protect? What if a small country decided that a larger country was carrying out these kinds of atrocities against its citizens? It's a slippery slope, and it's really the powerful countries that are going to be in a position to decide who needs protecting and who doesn't.
And then there was one question here, and that'll be our last question.
Yeah, this was kind of touched on a little bit earlier, but as it becomes increasingly clear that we're using these drone strikes on enemies that aren't really threats to the United States' safety, and our continued campaigns seem to be fostering nothing but resentment and future radicalization in these states, what do you think the actual motivation is for us to continue doing these drone strikes? Like, what is the reason to keep doing these? Because it seems increasingly confusing why we continue these campaigns.
That's a really good question. Foreign investment, U.S. foreign investment requires stability. And I'm of the mind that if Saddam Hussein had given U.S. oil companies good deals on Iraqi oil, he would still be there. We have supported many dictators. In fact, the CIA has engineered coups against democratically elected leaders in many countries and installed dictators in Iran, in Guatemala, in Chile, etc., and supported coups or turned their head the other way. So one thing is stability. Another thing is Israel. Israel is our main ally in the Middle East, although Saudi Arabia is certainly a major ally as well. And so to the extent that Israel feels threatened being in that region, the United States is going to take action commensurate with protecting Israel against what it perceives are threats to its future. And I think that is, there are neocons that want to control the area, particularly that oil-rich area of the Persian Gulf, but there are also many what are called Christian Zionists or evangelical Christians who read the scriptures to say that Jesus will not come back until the temple is rebuilt on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And there's a better chance it will be rebuilt if it's in Jewish hands than in Christian hands. And so they want to, that's a motivation for what they're doing. Now, of course, once the temple is rebuilt, Jesus comes back, then the scenario is that the Jews either convert to Christianity or get killed. That's a piece we don't hear about very often. But I think that Israel is really key to this, but it's not just Israel, it's also the neoconservatives who want to control the entire area, to maintain, to continue to be the dominant power in the Middle East. I mean, we did this when we played Iran and Iraq off against each other during the Iran-Iraq War, helping them both behind each other's back, goading Iran so that neither one would be too powerful on the Persian Gulf. But I don't know. I mean, maybe there is not any real systematic rationale to all of this. It really seems to be kind of a knee-jerk response. It's not clear whether there really is any concerted strategy. But I think it's a very, very dangerous game.
Okay, and the last question right here.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Dr. Cohn, thank you so much for your information and your work and your just commitment, I think, to this very important issue. It can be very discouraging for those of us who try to follow this and try to understand. Aside from the obvious that we are trying to, as far as humans and how we can react to this, the obvious of trying to be informed and understand what's happening and try to act and hopefully maybe elect better leaders than we have at this time. What else can you give us in terms of hope and looking for the future?
Yes, and that is an excellent question to end with. In fact, if I had planted a show, I would have that question. I really think, first of all, we need to educate ourselves about what's happening and coming to programs like this, reading our book, reading articles, going into the alternative press, Democracy Now, things like that are very important. But beyond that, one thing, Congress is dysfunctional, but one thing they do respond to is pressure from their constituents. And that means writing them, emailing them, calling them, and including the White House as well, sitting in their offices, exercising First Amendment rights to demonstrate and making it clear that we don't want these policies to continue in our name, that we don't want these things to perpetuate. And also writing op-eds in the newspaper, writing letters to the editor. It's not difficult to get a letter to the editor published. You peg it to an editorial or a news story, keep it under 150 words, and if your letter doesn't get published, you will have other letters from the same point of view get published because they count the number of letters there are from each point of view. So I think that, as citizens in a democracy, it is our responsibility to challenge our government when it is not doing the right thing, when it is not following the law, when it is not acting in a moral way, when it is actually endangering us with its policies, and make our voices heard.
All right, thank you. A round of applause.